Yeah, well, everything that can be, should be said, written about the Syrian conflict, war, tragedy has been written and said, and still allow me to make few short, brief comments. You know, we often say in Israel that we don't pray for miracles, we count on them, we take them into consideration in our calculation, and indeed when we look at Bashar al-Assad, now he's called in Syria the Liberator of Aleppo, but clearly is a magician, and I would like to point out two to three miracles that did occurred in Syria, which can also be seen as turning points in the war in Syria. First, of course, is the September 2013 miracle when President Obama took this strategical decision not to punish Bashar for using a chemical weapon against its own people. And by doing so, send a very clear message. If I didn't punish him, if I didn't intervene for that reason, probably I wouldn't intervene at all in Syria in the future. It was a clear message. It was real relief for Bashar and a clear message to the opposition. You can't really count on international support, clearly American support, and in such war of attrition, when somebody loses the hope for foreign intervention and support, it's crucial. So clearly, it can be seen as a turning point. And then the miracle of September 2015, you know, the Russian intervention that really changed things on the ground in Syria. The last miracle, I'm not sure, we still need to wait, the November, the elections, the results of the American elections. And we still need to wait and see. Now, coming back to Syria, you know, in the 50s, it used to be, we perceived it as a key for the control over the Middle East. I mean, there was a struggle for power, regional struggle for power between mainly at that time the Iraqis and Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptians under the presidency of Gamal Abdel Nasser. There was the Cold War, and in this struggle, Syria seemed to be one of the keys. Once you get control, influence over Syria, you might win this struggle, and as we know, Nasser won, and then the Soviets won this battle when it came to Syria. Then the 70s, 80s, 90s, Syria served as a model for a stable and strong regime, for a stable country, for the success of the so-called the territorial Middle Eastern country, artificial country, which was established by the British and the French, and still did well. This was Syria in the 80s, 90s. Now I think it should serve as a model for the total failure of the international community. When you look at Syria, you simply realize there is no such a thing that can be called the international community. We look at what happened in Syria. Almost 500,000 people were killed, most of them by the Syrian regime, not by ISIS. 1/3 of the population was forced to leave the country, not because of ISIS, but as a clear, direct result of the atrocities or of very specific and concrete policy carried out by the Syrian regime to change the demographical balance of Syria and to get rid not of only of those rebel groups, but those who support them. And Bashar made it very clear that the problem, as he sees, is not necessarily only with the rebels themselves, but with those who support them, the families, the relatives, the residents of their villages and small cities. So out of a total population of almost 24 million before the eruption of the war, we now speak about 9 million, and we can expect that this number might increase as a result of the success of the regime to defeat its enemies, 1/3 of the population. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, the use of chemical weapon. And where was the international community? It was not there. I think it's an important lesson for other countries in the region, clearly for Israel, which is often being told that, well, look around, be optimistic about the nature of this region. And when we come to countries that develop nuclear capabilities, unconventional capabilities, we are always being told, you know, these rulers are rational, they are not going to use it against you, there is this balance of terror and power, and still, in the Syrian case, he didn't use it against Israel, he used it against his own people. Now, as for the war in Syria, what started as a very limited, I would even dare to say peaceful, protest, mainly against social and economic background, and later on developed into a civil war, a war of jihad, and now it's part of a regional war and a Cold War. In the Syrian war, there is clearly the Syrian level, the Syrian floor. It has been a domestic conflict, but I don't think that it's the case anymore. We now need to pay attention to the regional dimension. Syria is a battleground for regional powers, mainly the Saudis, the Turks, and the Iranians, and a very unique Cold War when you can find the Russians, but you cannot find the Americans. I say that we should pay more attention to those dimensions, the regional and the international, because it's not anymore a Syrian war. The Syrians are totally exhausted. I mean, both sides, those who fight on the side of Bashar al-Assad are mainly Shiite volunteers, Iranian soldiers, fighters of Hezbollah, and of course, Russian and aircrafts. On the side of the rebels, we can see the support provided to them by the Turks and the Saudis and volunteers from all around the world who still arrive to Syria to fight the regime. It's not anymore a Syrian war carried out by the Syrians themselves. It's not anymore a war where the decisions are being taken by the Syrian players. It's interesting to find out that the formula which was achieved by the Russians in Moscow with the help of Turkey and Iran, well, the summit in Moscow took place with no American participation. This is not to surprise at all, but also without Syrian participation. Bashar was not there, he was not even asked. And the Turks didn't bother to ask the rebels, so it's not anymore in the hands of the Syrians. But clearly, Russia did well, and it's amazing to find out, first of all, that, you know, when the Arab Spring erupted, what we had in mind was the rise of the Sunni world. That's how we saw it. Yes, Sunni, Islamic, Sunni, sometimes Salafi, but the rise of the Sunni world after it was challenged by the Shiite world for so many years, at least at the beginning, it seemed to be as a major setback for the Russians. who supported and backed the secular regimes, and also for the Iranians. When we look at what was happening in Syria, in Egypt, Morsi was so hostile to the Iranians. It's not the case anymore. This Arab Spring turned to be a major development that opened the gate for the comeback of Russia and for the Iranians to spread their hegemony all over the Middle East. This is one thing that should be said as regard to the Russian involvement in Syria. The other thing is, look at what happened. You know, Putin didn't send his entire army. He sent something like several dozen aircrafts, helicopters, several thousands of his warriors, Russian soldiers, mainly technicians. And with this very limited involvement, of course, he based his intervention on the support of the Iranians, but on the ground, and still with so limited involvement, he achieved a dramatic victory. On the other hand, we just heard President Obama in the final press conference he gave in the White House in late December, mid-December actually, 2016, when he said, you know, I studied this crisis very deeply, and I came to the conclusion that if I'm to do something about it, I'll have to send, you know, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers and to spend trillions of dollars. And compare these two approaches, the American approach, everything or nothing, and the Russian approach. Let's send only 50 aircrafts. And with this very limited approach, as you can see, Putin did quite well with this brutality, with the use of Iranian and Shiite forces. Those are the forces who are fighting on the ground. He was able to defeat the rebels in some major strategic places in Syria, to recapture the city of Aleppo, to clean Damascus from the presence of rebel groups. He did well. But what is next in the Syrian war? And I can suggest three possible scenarios. First of all, the Spanish scenario, the civil war in Spain, 36 to 39, although in this case, Franco was the one who revolted against a legitimate government, and still the Spanish model offers us a model where eventually the regime, with the support of authoritarian powers, was able to crush the revolt. Yes, it took him some time. Also in our case, it can take Bashar several years. Clearly, he is not totally independent. He is dependent on Russian support and Iranian support, and still we cannot exclude the possibility that eventually it can take him several years. He can recapture the entire territory of Syria, and I can see a long line of all of those who criticize him and called for his resignation. I mean, those Western, American, even Israeli leaders standing as always in a long line in front of his palace to ask him to resume negotiation with Israel, to take into consideration their interests. So this is the Spanish model. The other model is the Afghan model, where you have a government in Kabul supported and totally dependent on the American presence, but the war is going on with ups and downs all over the country. This is also a possibility we can see in Syria with the support of the Saudis and the Turks. The war can continue in many parts of Syria, and any effort to unite the country once again, any effort by the regime to recapture parts of Syria which he lost, will eventually fail. This is also a possibility. The other possibility is, of course, it's still on the table, the Libyan model, where the country totally collapsed and militant rebel groups took over. This is what happened in Libya. This almost happened in Syria before the Russian intervention. Before the Russian intervention, the rebels were very close to capture Damascus, Aleppo, and other parts of Syria. So the possibility, this option was there before the Russian intervention. It's clearly unlikely to happen now with the Russian and the Iranian presence, but a dramatic change in the American policy. We still wait to see what is going to be the American policy, but still a dramatic change in the American policy, a decision to intervene, to get rid of Bashar, to create safe zones, can lead to a change on the ground in Syria. So this option, very unlikely right now, it's still on the table. But coming back to the point I made at the beginning of my talk, yes, some might win. Bashar clearly is one of the winners right now with the Iranians and the Russians, and it's surprisingly I am surprised to see the way Putin is trying to handle the crisis once he realized that the Americans are not there, and to broke a deal, something that shows us that mediators shouldn't be always honest, and reaching a deal is not always about just peace, but a deal that everybody can live with. So it's also a very interesting example. So there are those who won, but clearly there are those who lost everything, and these are the Syrians themselves, and very little was left of what used to be Syria. And when we speak about important strategical issues, there is something beyond strategy, and this is the humanitarian tragedy and the moral of the world, which disappeared in this tragic case. Thank you.